Hi, my name is Mavanwi Warwick and I'm EGM for Regulatory Compliance Global and Executive Sponsor for Rule of Law Initiatives at LexisNexis. This has involved being part of the Expert Reference Group for the Human Rights and Technology Project led by the Human Rights Commission. The final report was tabled in Parliament last year and it had recommendations on how to protect and promote human rights and how responsible innovation methods could be deployed to achieve positive outcomes. You can see the report at tech.humanrights.gov.au, but as a quick summary, it looks at how organisations develop and or use technology such as AI with a particular focus on recommendations for government decision-making and accessibility. I found the project really interesting and I'm really looking forward to continuing to work with people from different organisations across government, private sector, academia, civil society, and come up with some practical ways the recommendations can be implemented. I'm also interested in how the recommendations can apply to different role types. Board members, human resources and talent acquisition specialists, product managers and procurement, to name a few. And then I'm going to attempt to tie all of these multifaceted issues back to what it means for a compliance professional, those responsible in the organisation for ensuring that regulatory and legislative frameworks are documented and actioned with the appropriate controls. So I'm going to ask each of my guests to provide some practical tips on how to make the recommendations a reality. My working theory on this is that organisations that adhere to human rights frameworks will see positive benefits across a wide range of KPIs, including employee, customer, shareholder and financial outcomes. So I am very happy today to be joined by Emili Budell-Rhodes. Emili is lead evangelist, engineering culture at LexisNexis, and from my own experience, I know her as a purpose-driven innovator, passionate about creating inclusive, responsible tech with specialisations in analytics and AI. Her current role focuses on promoting and refining the enterprise-level technology strategy for our teams globally. Emili looks at ways to promote development best practices, including responsible AI, rooted in organisational values and driving customer outcomes through inclusion, psychological safety and cross-functional working. So thank you so much, Emili, for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm really interested in your views on this. I know that you're not located in Australia and part of our global team, but what do you see as the current challenges and opportunities that exist in the very large sphere of human rights and technology?
Well, that's a very, very big question. So let me maybe pick one opportunity and one challenge to answer it. In terms of an opportunity, I think we live in really exciting times when it comes to technology and human rights, because what we have in terms of the advancement of technologies, it's a space that is, really picking up pace. Some really exciting developments happening, and at the same time, we're facing very big challenges in this current times. And where I really see the opportunity here is that a lot of the challenges that we're trying to solve all have human rights implications, and we can put sophisticated technology to it as part of the solution. So think about things like climate change, for example. They have massive human rights implications. And so whatever we do in that space will have a positive impact, directly or indirectly, on human rights. The same goes for procurement and supply chain that's, being used, where technology is being used to make supply chains more efficient. Well, an efficient supply chain is usually a transparent supply chain. So where you're trying to then identify where issues are, that transparency through technology is really going to help. In terms of a challenge, plenty of those. And of course, you will have talked about a fair bit of those. There's a lot of debate going on in the media. I think maybe one thing I'd like to point out here that doesn't get talked about, in my opinion, enough, is that sometimes technology is still considered as somewhat of a separate field or a separate thing that's being handled and managed and looked after by a relatively small group of individuals and companies, and usually creators of technology. technology. But technology isn't just for technologists.
I love that. I might use that as my next catchphrase. Yeah.
It permeates every area of our lives. A lot of businesses nowadays could be considered digital businesses, even if they're not creating technologies, because they use technology to in their everyday processes. And so there's a piece here around who is part of the conversation, who's taking ownership with some of the issues that I think we need to explore a little bit more, because sometimes that conversation seems a little bit one-sided and we're missing a point.
Yeah, I wonder as well if after the pandemic that we are hopefully at the end of now has taught us how technology is really endemic in our lives, and how important accessibility is for everyone, not necessarily people who might be in the past have considered to have special attributes. So I think that's a really interesting theme that we should explore further. But one thing I really want to talk to you about today was, as I said, because the report obviously does look at technology, which is borderless, but you work across the global organisation, many different teams in different countries. How do you see the approaches differing across the world to some of the issues that we've already talked about?
Again, great question. Maybe something I want to start with, and it might seem like a really obvious statement, but technology is created by people for people.
And so you're coming up with some great sound bites, I have to say.
Thank you. And so, of course, depending on where your team is based, you're going to have different cultural influences and ways of doing things and ways of working that will impact how technology is developed, and particularly, when you're thinking about the human rights piece, and more generally, there's a whole debate around ethics in technology or ethics of AI. The ethics piece is really tricky because ethics can be very subjective. It can be highly shaped by where you are in the world, even within the same country, it can vary, right? So where we're coming from in terms of our overall technology strategy is more around responsible use and development of technology, and essentially creating a shared reference and a set of language that people can work with, that creates that bridge across different global regions, but also acknowledging that there needs to be that space for teams to lead some of those activities in their own way that makes sense for their own context as well. So it's a balance, I'd say.
Yeah, I think being a human interacting with other humans, I think that is a completely sensible way to approach that. And I'm really interested, I suppose, in what you're talking about, common language. Obviously, the human rights protocols should provide that for people in a way that possibly ethics does not. But if I can pick up on something you said in your early response about technology isn't just for technologists, one of the outcomes that was addressed in the report was the commercial cost of having to retrofit a product because you didn't have the right people in the room or the right levels of education in the room to do with human rights in the first place. Is that something that you're taking into consideration with the work that you're doing at LexisNexis?
Absolutely. I mean, one really important component in our overall approach to technology and our strategy is the importance of cross-functional teams. So thinking about technology not just as writing code or developing an algorithm or whatever it might be, but rather thinking about it in terms of a life cycle approach. And so that would necessarily also involve non-technical roles. Right? Customer-facing roles, compliance roles, like all of these kinds of roles that we don't necessarily always think about as active participants within technology. So making sure that we create the space and the opportunity to trigger those important conversations, and to also really encourage teams to seek different perspectives from domain experts, from customers themselves. Like all of this is actually really important in how you design technology, and then how that sort of continues to shape how you create it going forward.
Yeah, I think that point about that continuous improvement, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, is really important. So that is definitely a key part of the human rights impact assessment tool, which is recommended within the report. But I know that there are different ways of using different kinds of frameworks in organisation. What's something that you're looking at the moment, and how have you gone about addressing all of the challenges you've already raised about working across a global scale?
So let me take that last bit first, how to address all these different challenges, I'd say one by one.
Excellent. Very practical.
Yes. Because, they can be quite tricky and have dependencies with other things. So there's a fair bit of analysis and introspection going on as well, and ongoing conversation within that spirit of continuous improvement and cross-functional collaboration. I guess one thing that's probably worth mentioning here is our set of responsible AI principles that I was very fortunate to develop as I transitioned into tech from a corporate responsibility background. And so these principles obviously sort of broader guidelines for the organization. They're a subset of our enterprise level technology strategy, because we don't want to look at them as a separate domain, but rather understand how teams currently work and understand how all the already good, healthy processes and due diligence and other things that we've got in place can be leveraged to in the best way possible. When it comes to the human rights impact assessment, that is actually part of the framework that I'm looking to embed right now. It's not just about human rights, but more generally talking about and thinking about potential impacts on people as part of a wider conversation when we're putting together ideas of, a new feature or a new solution we want to develop. So being quite proactive, encouraging that conversation and dialogue across teams, and again, creating multiple opportunities to get in different sets of expertise and perspective. And I think within that, it's also important to highlight, there's no one size fits all approach. There's no necessarily a right or wrong way either, because technology is so contextual as well, right? It's a way to solve a problem. So are you solving the problem in the best possible way is kind of at the root of what we're trying to do and encourage.
Yeah, and I think what I've seen come through the report and also other conversations is what's the right answer today might not be the right answer tomorrow, which is why the approach to continuous improvement is so important. But if I can pick up on something else, I think underlying what you've identified is how important culture is to these conversations. And although itself, I'm sure you will tell me, is just as contextual as ethics or technology itself, how do you think that is something that's informing the work that you're doing, or how do you make that part of your success measure?
Yeah, culture is hugely important. That's why I've got culture in my job title.
It's great.
Yeah. I mean, very simply put, you can have the most well thought out, perfect strategy in place. If you don't have the organizational culture to underpin it, it's not going to be very effective. Yeah. So trying to, again, find the right balance between the two. And for example, having a culture where, continuous feedback, continuous improvement, the ownership of the strategy, feeding into it, evolving it over time, is really part and parcel of what we do day to day. So that teams actually feel enabled to shape that strategy as well. And so within that, for example, something we haven't yet talked about are things like inclusion and diversity and psychological safety. Psychological safety is about making sure that people feel comfortable speaking up and don't fear that they might be judged or have something happen to them, a negative happening to them as a result of that. And so when you think about that in terms of for example, an agile technology team, that is literally the heart of agile working, right? It's that constant iterating, questioning, challenging, improving over time. Well, if you don't have trust within a team, that's not going to work really well. So what can we do in order to really embed that into the everyday experience of teams at LexisNexis is really, really key. I think the other piece maybe to think about, talked about cross-functional working earlier, this also sets teams and organizations more generally up to deal a lot better with change, right? Is when you have a culture of asking these broader questions to think about what your impact potentially is, and you make that sort of part of your day-to-day work, you're going to be a lot better at bringing in different sort of challenge assumption, bring in perspectives, anticipate what might be needed in future as well. What changes might be coming our way, how will we deal with them? That suddenly becomes a lot less scary, I guess, as well, and will make organizations more resilient and more relevant over time.
I think all of these points would resonate with compliance professionals as well, moving away from a ticker box approach to an actual day-to-day embedding in the culture, making people feel safe to ask the question. And certainly from my experience as a leader, having the people who will ask you the tough questions at the beginning of the process rather than the end is extremely valuable. And breaking down silos, again, is a challenge for probably every organisation outside a startup culture. Everyone's busy on their day jobs, but being able to explain how it will actually benefit them and the organisation, and everyone likes to think they're doing the right thing as well, which sort of ties into my next and almost my penultimate question, which is, you're in a great position coming from a corporate affairs part of the business to a technology role. I've always seen that there is a strong adherence to CSR, or corporate social responsibility frameworks, being linked to strong commercial outcomes, strong employee and customer engagement. And I would love to demonstrate examples where that's the same, where you adhere to human rights frameworks. What are your thoughts on this?
So within that, I think a few things that I've already mentioned, which are around having that introspection, asking the broader question, looking at the bigger picture. And within that, I think, going a little deeper than what some people might think corporate responsibility is, which is often thought of as, philanthropy, for example, which is great and it's really important component.
I know you're not against philanthropy.
No, I used to, run a community program. I love donations and supporting charities, but in the end, corporate responsibility is broader than that, because it's about looking at the materiality of your organization, right? So it's really asking questions like, what are we uniquely good at? And what does our long-term impact in the world look like? What are the unique opportunities for us to make a positive difference? What does our stakeholder landscape look like? Or the ecosystem, like stakeholder ecosystem, if you will. What are the core risks that we have or that are coming our way? How do we mitigate them? Those are some really big questions. And within an organization that has got a strong corporate responsibility culture, these get asked again and again. And, there are obviously a number of different frameworks in place as well in order to report on progress and what's being done about these different questions. So there's actually a lot of rigor within having a good corporate responsibility approach. And it's really going to the core of how business is done. It's not something that you do on the side or on top of everything else. And so when it comes to human rights, it's basically the same thing. And as I was saying right at the start, human rights permeate most, if not all, material issues in one way or another. So what I'd say is maybe use it as a lens to look at these issues and kind of practice that. Having a culture where you ask these types of questions, where you have a strong focus and proactively deliberately put an emphasis on human rights, that will generate some healthy questions and debates. You'll get really valuable insights from that as well, and you'll learn over time, right? But what you were saying earlier, it's not just a tick box exercise at all, but rather how is that ongoing sort of mindset that you're cultivating over time.
So I'm a little hesitant to ask this because I feel throughout this conversation you've given us a lot of practical tips, but if you want to summarise or just highlight a couple of key ones, I think that'd be a great way to end our discussion.
Absolutely. And the report, came up with a lot of really useful recommendations, which are all going to be a really interesting work stream in their own right. So I think maybe 2 practical tips, if I can give 2. One is, don't reinvent the wheel. Get to know how things are actually done across your organization right now, because change is really hard.
Agree.
And so in order to get people on board and also make that change manageable and understandable over time, is actually to leverage the good stuff that you're already doing and enhance it over time. And that means also understanding, where do these recommendations actually uniquely fit for us? Of course, there will be standards and certain guidelines and practices in place, but it's also really about that, again, that introspection and understanding where your unique impact is. And the other piece, and I've said this before, but working with cross-functional inclusive teams, so really creating that space to break down the silos, get different sets of expertise into the room so that you can look at the best way to solve a problem from a variety of angles as well. That will help you innovate and be nimble and agile over time.
I think that's a great way to end this, because I think it is combining what I learned from the project, which is doing the good thing is also doing the right thing for your organisation. So thank you so much, Emili. That's been really interesting and really practical.
Thank you for having me.